Randolph Murdaugh Jr., better known as Buster, replaced his father as solicitor in 1940 when he was only 25. At that time, he had only been a lawyer for 2 years, but was allowed to take these important reins with so little experience. Beyond prosecuting, he also investigated many cases, though he had no law enforcement, investigative, forensic, or any such experience or training whatsoever. It was undeniably nepotism that put him in this important role, and he used it to his own benefit for the entirety of his career. As we've seen in the Murdaugh Mafia series, he was protected by high-level family and friends and used his position to control the court system in his area. He chose who got prosecuted and who got leniency. He protected an enormous system of bootlegging for over a decade. He stole from his clients. He was rumored to be able to make people disappear, and he was so slippery that every time he was investigated, or even when he was indicted, he slipped right out of it, becoming bolder each time. This piece of history is so fascinating that already in the few years since Alex Murdaugh broke the family's power and reputation to the point that less and less people are afraid to speak, there have been many books and articles written about this family, each one seeming to get progressively more informative. In researching for my series here, Murdaugh Mafia Rise and Fall, I've uncovered enough to fill volumes of books, and I have a long way to go yet. With this episode, I'm introducing a new branch of the Murdaugh Mafia story that I'm simply calling the bonus episodes, where instead of focusing directly on the family, I'll be adding extra information that I've come across. This first bonus episode will focus on one of Buster's cases from the time he took over as solicitor in 1940. This episode focuses on the murder of Dr. Curtis F. Metz and the subsequent trial of his murderer, Clarence Bell. I'm Cassidy O'Connell, and this is Murdaugh Mafia bonus episodes. Buster's Cases, the accidental and excusable murder. Welcome. Dr. Curtis Faust Metz Jr. was a 26-year-old optometrist from Columbia, South Carolina. After growing up in Columbia, he attended a college in Illinois and returned to Columbia, where he worked with his father for 1 year before moving to Beaufort and starting his own practice. He was described as popular and a high type of gentleman. Dr. Metz was not yet married. His life had just begun, really, when the day after Randolph Sr. died, he was shot to death in a case of mistaken identity. Unlike most murders, the details of the murder, the who, what, why, when, where, was all pretty much revealed instantly. Not only were there witnesses, the murderer did not flee the scene, and he confessed the whole story then and there, and we'll get to that in a moment. Dr. Metz left behind his parents and 3 brothers. For reasons I'll never understand, they would never see true justice for their grievous loss. Right away with his death announcement, we learn the shooter's name was Clarence Bell. Clarence Bell worked for a Beaufort produce concern. A produce concern is a business that deals with the production, distribution, and sale of produce. And the shooting happened somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m. We also learn that Metz was returning home with a group of friends, that Bell rode up behind them and opened fire when Metz stopped the car. These details get cleared up a little later, but Bell made no attempt to escape, and he told police it was a case of mistaken identity. And as with many a murder, it was a love triangle, as they say in the newspapers, about a woman. The first thing that really gets to me is that this fact was known that very night. The Sheriff McTeer, says that Bell had called him about an hour before the murder and told them that he was going to kill the man and the woman if he ever caught them together. Now, instead of sending someone over to see what's going on when you hear murderous threats of a double homicide, the sheriff tells him to go to bed. That's it. Go to bed. An hour later, Metz is dead. This was the first fail for the Metz family. Now, things seemed to move really fast back then. His services were held the very next day, and the articles stress again what a widely popular man he was. And on August 1st, the state newspaper prints a very moving tribute to Dr. Metz, saying that during his short life, he had earned the respect of the community and the affection of his many friends. They describe him as quiet, unassuming, almost shy in his regard for the feelings of others, that he was a gentleman in the true sense of the word. Those who knew him felt privileged in his friendship and in the enjoyment of his quiet dignity, keen wit, and genuine cordiality, never forward in manner, always tolerant in his judgment of others, capable in his profession, and constantly willing in his support of civic and cultural causes. They say he was a young man whose ability and manner of living gave rich promise for the future. That such a man should be the victim of the type of tragedy that befell him is almost beyond belief. The blast of fire that took his life was never earned by him, and his loss will be deeply felt by this community in which he had gained a respected and important position. Less than 4 months later, the case has already gone to trial, and the trial only lasts 2 days, start to finish. It's presided over by none other than Judge Strom Thurmond, who we've heard about several times in this series. And it was prosecuted by Buster, who just officially becomes solicitor, with the assistance of Marshall Williams of Orangeburg. On day 1, we identify the woman behind it all. It's Belle's own wife. Now, in the course of her testimony, she says her husband shot Dr. Metz because he was passing notes between her and this other man. It goes on to say that Dr. Metz and several others in the car became aware that they were being followed. Dr. Metz went back to the other machine and the shooting followed. Now, previously, it sounded like Belle had shot through the car when it stopped, but now we hear that Metz got out of his car and started to approach Belle. And according to Mrs. Belle, the husband knew Metz as the man facilitating his wife's affair. Now, this is quite different from the original story that says he shot when the car was stopped and that it was a case of mistaken identity. Now, it sounds like Mrs. Belle is trying to say that her husband shot Metz on purpose for assisting with the affair. This is quite different from her husband's story. Day 2 brings a lot more details about the affair. First of all, we learn the name of the affair partner, Lorenz Wilder. And we learn that this affair had been going on for 6 months. And it's made even more hurtful with the fact that during this time, Wilder was pretending to be Belle's best friend. And worse still, Mrs. Belle had actually encouraged this. It's so sick and sordid. And though not an excuse for murder, it had to have brought Belle to a pretty sick headspace when it was revealed. A double betrayal of epic proportions. Because in addition to the affair, Wilder had tried to get her to leave Belle, her 2 children, and go with him. She refused, and Wilder then proposed getting rid of Belle since she wasn't willing to leave him. This idea must have unnerved her. Because it turns out, like most dirty cheaters, she didn't actually want to lose her husband. Her husband, who had no idea about any of this, had taken her out to the yacht club dance that night. And they came home at 2, and she decided to confess it all to him. The affair, and even the proposal of murder. All of it. Perhaps to warn him. Now, after hearing all of this, inexplicably, Belle goes to sleep. I can't even imagine hearing news like that. And going to sleep. But maybe it was just too much to even take in. Maybe he had had too much to drink. They had been out at the dance that night. But for whatever reason, he goes to sleep. The phone rings, and it's none other than Dr. Metz. He's making the call for Wilder, probably just in case it was Mr. Bell that answers the phone, because obviously Wilder is a filthy coward. Now, the fact that Metz calls the home at this hour makes me think that Mr. Bell must have known him, because why would it have been okay for this doctor to be calling at 2 a.m.? But at any rate, once she picks up, Metz passes the phone to Wilder, who tells her to come back to the Ribault Inn immediately. And being the darling person that she is, she leaves her devastated husband and their 2 young children at home and heads back to the inn. When Bell takes the stand, he fills in what she missed and tells the court that he was in such a state of shock he didn't remember much about what happened, but he remembers that he woke up shortly after and noticed that his wife and his car were missing. He starts walking and flags down a passing taxi and heads back to the inn as well, where they had attended the dance earlier. And he finds them there. Going back to her testimony, she claims that her husband found her sitting in a booth with Wilder and that he beat them both and left. Back to Bell's testimony, he says he got in his car that his wife had driven there and headed back home, where he called the sheriff, telling him he was going to shoot his wife and Wilder. The sheriff tells him to go to bed, but instead, he packs a suitcase and 2 shotguns and heads back to the inn. He sees Wilder's truck and, believing it to be Wilder and his wife, starts to follow it, and he claims not to remember anything after that. There's a lot of missing information here, because the truck does belong to Wilder, but we have Metz driving, and of the 5 people listed as being in the car, Wilder is not one of them. And none of the papers say where Wilder went after being beaten and why he wasn't in the car, or why Metz was driving it. And we see their names listed here: Miss Sue Rogers, Miss Hazel Whitehurst, and Russell Sermon, who with Mrs. Bell were in the truck driven by Dr. Metz on the night he was killed. So as we heard earlier, they realized they were being followed. Metz stops the truck, gets out, and approaches Bell. What was he intending to do exactly? I can't help but wonder, why did this man choose to get so involved in this affair? He'd been facilitating it. He helped Wilder call the home that night. Now he's driving Wilder's truck and approaching Mr. Bell while he's got Mrs. Bell in his truck. Now we have Bell, who's out of his mind. It's possible he's drunk. That's just a guess. There's nothing of note about that. This is long before the days of them testing someone's alcohol level. But I think it's a possibility since they had gone out that night. And just by the way that he just immediately fell asleep, it makes me think that it might be a possibility. But at any rate, he sees this man approaching his truck. Now in his mind, which is surely not clear at the moment, he's been told by his wife, not just about the affair, but that this man wants to kill him. So it is entirely possible that what he says is true. He thought it was Wilder getting out of the truck, and he fired on him. Is it possible that what his wife says is true and that he did it because Metz was facilitating the affair? It could be too. But credibility-wise, she's a liar, she's a cheater. Obviously very good at deception. She deceived her husband for 6 months. Once someone's credibility is blown, how do you know if you can believe them or not? But in the state of mind he was in, it could be. I mean, maybe they were built the same. It was dark. It was the middle of the night. It very well could have been a case of mistaken identity. However, does that really matter? When you come out with the intent to murder, does it really matter who you're shooting? I mean, your motive is bad. You're there to kill. So I don't think this absolves him of any guilt. In his defense, 3 doctors testify that he could have been temporarily insane at the time of his shooting. His attorneys focus on the fact that his life had been threatened, and threatened by the man who owned this truck that Metz was driving and climbed out of. They actually use the words accidental and excusable. Accidental and excusable. How can it be accidental? He told the sheriff what he was going to do. He packed not 1, but 2 guns, and he headed out to find them. Saying it was an accident because of the mistaken identity is so off base, because it seems to say that he wasn't plotting a double homicide. Like, if he had shot the 2 people he'd meant to shoot, it would have been okay. But oops, he didn't shoot them. He accidentally shot someone else. I mean, it's absurd. And where can I even begin with the word excusable? Self-defense is legally excusable. If someone has a gun on you or yours and you shoot to save your own life or your loved one's life, it's legally sound. But that was not the situation here. This was a premeditated murder. He just shot the wrong person. That is far from excusable. Now, one newspaper article states that the jury took about 3.5 hours to deliberate. Another says 5 hours, but it was basically from afternoon to early evening, and the jury finds Bell guilty of manslaughter, not murder. And when it comes to sentencing, Judge Thurmond sentences him to 2 years. 2 years. This man told the sheriff what he was going to do. He packed 2 guns and a suitcase, chased the car down, fired on a man, took the life of a 26-year-old optometrist, a family's pride and joy, and got 2 years. Like I said at the beginning, this was one of Buster's first cases after officially becoming solicitor. And in my opinion, a little piece of justice broke on that November day, along with the hearts of the Metz family. And just like that, the story of Dr. Curtis Metz Jr. was over. His father lived on until 1961, and his mother till 1973. His brother Kenneth named one of his sons Curtis, and we can't know if he was simply putting his father's name back out there, because it seems in that part of the country they're all about seniors, juniors, thirds, and so on, so it might have been just doing that, but I'd like to think that it was a way to honor his brother Curtis and his very short life. Our next bonus episode will be about a chiropractor. Until then, this is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.